Welcome. What do you do when you get into a discussion of climate change in a social setting? What do? Clam up, play it safe, try a deep dive into scientific and economic matters, resort to name calling and political polarization? Well, the start of the United Nations Global Climate Summit 2 days ago in Glasgow almost guarantees you'll find yourself in such conversations over the next 2 weeks. So it'd be a good idea to be well prepared. Our guest tonight, Dr. Kelvin Kemm, a South African nuclear physicist who has studied debates over climate change for decades, offers some keen insights into how to handle such situations as we discuss his just published article, Climate Change, Ebb and Flow of the Tide. That'll be our main topic this evening. Before we get to that, before we bring Dr. Kemm in with us, I would just like to tell you a little bit about the program, a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance, and offer you a free book. The Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a network of just under 70 scholars, about a third natural scientists, a third economists, and a third theologians, philosophers, ethicists, working to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we tie all of those things together. The live stream program that you're watching right now from the stacks is designed to bring to you experts from a variety of different fields so that you can hear them discuss these issues and then pass on what you learn to your friends, to your family, to fellow church members, co-workers, even to legislators who represent you in your city, your state, your local, your national governments. And so we hope that this program will be a lot of fun for you, and that you will indeed tell your friends about it as you get opportunity. Well, we also want to offer you this month, throughout the month of November, a brand new book by my good friend David Fowler. David is a former Tennessee state senator. He's the president of Family Action Council of Tennessee, factn.org. That's FACTN.org. He's a very strong Christian man, and he's written this brand new book called Recovering the Constitution, using the Ninth Amendment to restore civil liberty. It's a fascinating book, and this is not the typical topic for Cornwall Alliance, and yet what we recognize is that just as the COVID pandemic has turned into a rationale for lots and lots of government restrictions on people's liberties, so also there are many people in the climate alarmist movement around the world, from high government positions to neighborhood climate activists, who really want to see governments using the effort to fight climate change as a reason to impose many restrictions on people's lives. Well, here in the United States, of course, we have the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights. And those guarantee for us some significant freedoms, and they put significant limits on government. The problem is that over about the last 100 years or so, much of what the Constitution requires in the way of limiting government and respecting individual freedoms has been undermined by various court decisions. David Fowler, in Recovering the Constitution, explains how a little known part of the Bill of Rights, the Ninth Amendment, can actually be the path to correcting a whole lot of this, and why what this means is that state and local officials do not have to refrain from implementing laws just because the Supreme Court might have forbidden implementation of a similar law or even an identical law in a different location. It's a fascinating book, and for those of you who, like me, love liberty and want to see our constitutional order restored, I really hope that you'll want to read this. So, to ask for your free copy of this, just simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-11, that's promo code 21-11, or the title, Recovering the Constitution, or both, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. And 100% of your gift, no matter how small, will be tax deductible. So thank you very much again for tuning in. And now let's welcome to the program Dr. Kelvin Kem. He's joining us from Pretoria, South Africa, where he is 6 hours ahead of us. So this is well past midnight for Kelvin, and I really appreciate his being willing to come on at such a strange time. But Kelvin, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. I'm very pleased to be with you.
I'm thinking back to March when we had you and your associate, Mr. Msebenzi, another energy engineer from South Africa, on to discuss the needs of the African peoples for abundant, affordable, reliable electricity. And you two were really, really helpful in that. But tonight we're going to be discussing your article, Climate Change, Ebb and Flow of the Tide, which we just published on Cornwall Alliance's website yesterday, I believe it was. And I would really encourage our visitors to go there. Just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the blog, and scroll down a little bit, and you'll find this particular article. It actually has, let's see, what was it? There are 62 points in it, and there's no way in the world that we would get through all of those. But you do a great job of explaining in there how to bring basic facts, very important facts, to bear in conversations. And what you set up is basically, okay, you find yourself in a social setting. Maybe you're with your family, maybe you're at a party, a church gathering, some community organization or something, and people start talking about climate change. And that's especially likely, granted that COP26, the 26th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework on Convention on Climate Change, is happening right now in Glasgow. And you want to help people to understand, how do you go about talking about these things? So first, Kelvin, would you just tell us, I mean, you're a nuclear physicist and a nuclear engineer. How is that relevant to the climate change debate? And how did you become so interested over the years in this topic?
Well, I do a lot of strategic work as well for all sorts of companies, solving problems for them. If there's something on a production line not working, or there's some snag, whatever, I'll go along and say, right, let's analyze this the way a physicist would analyze this. What is actually going on? And so that is a lot of the work that I do, as well as doing the nuclear work. And part of that led me to being interested in issues that are problematic and need some sort of analysis. And many, many years ago now, when there was the issues with the ozone layer and CFCs and various other things like that, I started looking at this. I also got interested in public awareness of science, because so many members of the public don't know what's going on. Science is complicated, it's difficult. And I sometimes get people will say to me, can you explain Einstein's theory of relativity to me? But just 1 minute. The answer is no, you can't. If you really want me to explain Einstein's theory, give it an hour. You know, we need an hour or something. But you can say, all right, over a glass of wine at a cocktail party, I'll give you a 1 or 2 minute sketch of what it's about. But that means you've got to drastically cut corners, and you've got to drastically simplify. And sometimes when I've done that, some of my science friends will say to me, but you didn't quite tell the truth. You didn't explain that and that and that. And I say, well, look, you've either got to give a short version to fit in the 2 minutes, or you've got to give the long version. There's no way sort of in between, really. It's very difficult. So I became interested in how do you take some complex topics and try and turn them into layman's language so it means something. And it's actually hard work. And over the years, I got interested in this. And the climate issue came in as one of them, because, of course, the more people started talking about it, the more they said, what exactly is going on? And I found myself trying to tell them. Now, in fact, you scroll down my article a few moments ago, and you'll see that a lot of the points there are actually numbered. And what happened
Mm-hmm.
was, I was one evening at a social function in exactly the situation, and somebody said to me, what's happening? And so I said, well, the science says this and this and this. They say, yes, but the United Nations or something doesn't agree with you. And I said, the reason why is this. And what's happened with this whole climate affair is that there's huge political intrusion into the thing. All sorts of people
Yeah.
have climbed in and have become overnight authorities. So as I was explaining, I would say, look, that and that and that is science, but then this happened politically. And then,
Yeah.
see, more science says this. So then I realized that there's no articles that really do this. You either get the science article or you get the argument on the political side, but trying to bring the two together, I don't think there's much in that way. So that's why I did this. I
It's really
wrote
tough.
down a list, and yeah, and it got bigger, and eventually I put the whole thing together, and people have reacted pretty well to it. I'm very pleased at the
Yeah.
response. So that's how it came about.
Have you found a pretty at least a patient reception, if not a grateful reception on the part of people who have a different perspective on this from your own? I mean, people who would be more prone to embrace the sort of alarmist attitude about climate change.
Yes, well, then what you get is you'll get people at an extreme to the point at which they don't want to change their mind, and no matter what you say, they're not going to change their mind. You get others
Yeah.
that are well-meaning people that are misguided. Those ones are happy to change if you explain. You'll find
Yeah.
young mothers, for example, are a typical group where the young mothers are terribly worried about their children, which is a natural biological instinct. So they say, if this is going to harm my child, I'm
Yeah.
opposed to it. Then you say, no, that's not true. Let me explain the truth. And they say, oh, is that the truth? Oh, then I'm prepared to change my mind. So
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
people happily change their mind. That's why it's important to be able to address their frame of reference to say, look, this is the truth of what's going on.
Yeah.
Some
In
people are
your
just
article, you
beyond
make
it.
some. In your article, you make some reference to the fact that, frankly, you don't find the very alarmist language that you get from politicians in the media and environmental activists. Existential threat, climate crisis, climate emergency, catastrophic warming, things like that. You don't find any of that language in the actual scientific assessment reports that come from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Um, do you find that when you point that out to people, that the actual scientific documents from the IPCC really refrain from using that sort of language? Does that tend to help?
Yes, it is. Now, that's interesting that you should mention, because I have very little faith in the IPCC. And something that happens with them is that there's this large number of scientists involved. A couple of my science colleagues have been IPCC researchers and have
Mm-hmm.
resigned because they've been unhappy. But what happens is that the IPCC researchers work and do all the science work. They put together a huge report. When they've put together
Mm-hmm.
that huge report, then politically appointed government representatives go through that and they select out what's called the assessment report. And the assessment report is a much smaller document. The assessment report's contents are voted on by these people. They then create
Yeah,
that
they
document,
refer
which
to it
is
as the
brought out
summary
a
for
couple of weeks
policymakers.
before the science. That's right, summary for policymakers. They present that
Yeah.
to the media, they give that to the policymakers, and so on. So they read that thing that has been voted into existence by these people that have got various vested interests. And sometimes what has appeared in those the summary for policymakers, the AR, and the most recent one was AR6, I think it was, has been very
Hmm.
different to what the scientific conclusion is. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the science people concluded. So the whole thing
Yeah.
is not
Yeah.
a trustworthy exercise, the IPCC, and it's become very
Yeah.
politicized, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Mm,
There's actually, I agree with you. I don't generally trust the IPCC very much. Its top leaders are too much intertwining science and politics. And yet, there is
mm,
really a good bit of good review of the scientific literature in their, massive assessment reports. The one that just came out
mm,
at the end of July, the first volume of the what's going to be called the sixth assessment report. First volume being
mm,
4,499 pages long, I think it is.
mm,
Uh,
exactly.
there's actually a good bit of review of the scientific literature, but then when they go from reviewing the literature to trying to make inferences from it, that's where they really get away from, I think, the best observational evidence. And then besides that, they depend so heavily on global climate models, which are really, those are not evidence about anything. Models are hypothesis, and they need to be tested by
Mm,
observations. And what we know about the models is that they simulate about anywhere from 2 to 4 times as much warming from added CO2 in the atmosphere as the observations would justify. I do want to mention to our audience that Kelvin is with us on battery on his computer there in Pretoria, South Africa, because they are in the midst of a power blackout there, which is a good reminder of how important reliable electricity is, reliable grid electricity, to have the kind of steady, high quantity electricity that is necessary for modern life. Uh, Kelvin, tell us a bit about what's going on there now with this blackout, and how frequent is this sort of thing in South Africa? And is the effort by the South African
mm.
government to fight climate change, is that contributing in any way to this?
I'd like to also pick up on two other points that you made there, but to answer your question, we've
Sure.
had quite a bit of this for a while now. In years gone by, it never occurred ever. And
Hmm.
then with the use of solar and wind and so on, baseload conventional supply was not produced adequately. So we found that we were getting closer and closer and closer to having no reserve margin. That's what it boils down to. Now we're sitting in a position
Hmm.
where the country's got effectively no reserve margin. So if a turbine goes on the blink at some power station, quite often there's not enough power to supply the country. And
Hmm.
we go for months with no problem, and then they will have, say, 2 or 3 breakdowns in quick succession in 3 different places, and that then leaves them in trouble with no power to supply the entire country. So they have a system here called load shedding, where they say, right, everybody shares equally. So they don't just drop the power in one place. You get notified via the internet and on your cell phone and so on that you will have load shedding. Now, in our case now, it was from midnight here until 2 a.m. the power will be off. And they deliberately switch off the power around the country to various suburbs in sequence so that they can have a bit of time now to fix the repair. They might get it done by morning, in which case it'll all be over by morning, whatever caused the failure today. But if it goes on for more than a day or two, we can have this for a day or two where they cut the power. And it's, of course, terribly irritating because at times you're busy working on something or other, and all of a sudden there's no electricity. And so it's
Yeah.
become quite a big joke here as well. People draw all sorts of cartoons and make jokes and all sorts of stuff like that. But just going back to 2 points that you mentioned, the one was about the reliable supply. Now, that's terribly important. Now, I saw that President Buhari of Nigeria at COP26 now has emphasized the need for Africa to have reliable, continuous power. And
Yes.
I quite
Yeah.
support what he said. And he said, we're not going to be pushed around by the first world because you've got into trouble and everything. Now you come and tell us that we can't supply power to our people.
Yeah.
And I fully support him. In fact, exactly that message was also presented by the president of Uganda, President Museveni, about a week earlier.
Yes.
And I fully support these people. And they must carry on and do exactly that, because this is what we have now. Now, the other point I wanted to take up on that you mentioned was models. Now, we have these models, and people are forever saying, oh, the computer model says so-and-so, as if it's going to be accurate. Now, at the moment, the feeling is that these computer models are something like 50% accurate, if you're lucky. Now, any computer model, they're very sophisticated models, so one has to admire the scientists that put all the work into it. But the fact that these models are so incredibly complicated indicates to you just how many variables and how much stuff there is to put into them. You know, if you want to make a model of I'm going shopping, and you want to make a model of what do you do, and you've got to go and buy some food, and then you want to go and buy some clothes and some shoes and some this, you can create a computer model that tells you how long you're going to spend at each shop and what sequence and all this type of thing. That would be a very difficult exercise to do as well, because you've got to put an input in that you can trust. And now if I was to say, all right, I'm going to go and buy some food and it's going to take me 20 minutes, and then I'm going to go and buy some shoes, which will take me 3/4 of an hour and so on, you can generate this model. But if something changes, you say, I think I'll buy 2 pairs of shoes, then all of a sudden your timing is out. And the model can't possibly give you an accurate answer if something changes, unless you've really taken it into account. Now, in the computer models, there's no ways they can have taken everything into account. For years now, they've come up with a model. They say, here's a model, they give a prediction. Then a year later, so they've got a better model, which changes the output of the other one. And they keep improving the models. Good for them. They keep improving the models, but each model now shows you why the previous one was wrong or not adequate.
Yes.
There's absolutely no reason to believe that the ones they've got now are adequate either. If you put a slight different input into it, it can tell you it's going to rain in the middle of the Sahara, you see. Yeah. So these people say, computer model says that we're going to have 1.2 degrees. You've got to say, no, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that point. You say that they're improving the models all the time, and yet the 6th generation models, what they refer to as CMIP-6, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, 6th generation, those actually are worse than the 5th generation. The 5th generation averaged about 2.5. Some of them went as much as 3 times as high warming over the past 50 years or so as actually has been observed. CMIP-6 are averaging 3 to 4 times as much warming as actually observed. This is something that Dr. John Christie and Dr. Roy Spencer at the University of Alabama have pointed out, as have some others. And you would think that after another 6 years and spending billions and billions of dollars trying to improve these models, they would actually get closer to reality. And the opposite is what's happening. And I think that's because the modelers are operating on the assumption that carbon dioxide is the primary driver of global average temperature. And yet there are good reasons to think that's not the case. You discuss some of those in your article, fairly late in the article. Tell us about what are some of the natural causes of changes in global temperature?
Well, first, let's just have a look at a couple of things we know. The one thing we know is that the temperature of the planet has gone up by about 1 degree Celsius since the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, since the Crimean War, and since the time that Charles Darwin wrote his famous book, Origin of the Species, from then. Now, we're forever hearing that it's gone up since the industrial age. And that's now a trick to make people think the industrial age is automatically to blame, But it isn't. There's no more reason to pick the industrial age as your starting point than it is to say since the Crimean War or since Darwin published his book. If you keep saying since Darwin published his book, everybody says, well, clearly it's Darwin's fault. and it isn't. So we know that the temperature has gone up. What we also know is that carbon dioxide concentration has gone up. Now, it's gone up a tiny amount. The concentration has gone up from 280 parts per million approximately at the time of Charles Darwin, say, to 420 now. Now, that might sound like quite a bit, but it's 0.04%. It's not even a tenth of a percent, it's 0.04% of the atmosphere. So it's a tiny, tiny amount. Then you've got to say, is this tiny amount really going to do what everybody says in this tiny temperature rise? And then I read, oh, there's a temperature rise, people are going to die of heat waves and all. That's just not true. The temperature's got almost like nothing to do with it, in the sense that you're not going to feel a temperature rise. You move from one city in the US to another city in the US, the temperature variation is much greater. Where I am in Pretoria is a bit lower than Johannesburg, which is 40 miles away. And there's typically a 3-degree difference. Pretoria is always about 3 degrees warmer than Johannesburg. So what it says to you is, if the worst of the climate predictions come true, then Johannesburg will end up with the same climate that I've got all of the time. That's it. So, this argument is just silly. Now, what in fact the physics argument is, the true argument is that if there's an extra heat loading in the atmosphere, like this 1 or 2 degrees or something, that air will rise because physics tells you that hot air goes up. And if that air rises, it'll suck other cooler air in underneath, and that cooler air can come in bringing wet air, which can turn into rain and precipitate and so on. So this temperature change is not to do with the temperature that you're going to feel if you walk outdoors. It's to do with a change in the patterns on the Earth. That is where the thing comes into play. Not, oh, we're all going to die of heat and there's going to be more heat strokes and so on. So, you've got to see there's much more to this than meets the eye.
Okay, but you say that this doesn't so much apply to the temperature that you're going to be feeling, but let's see. There's
well, for example,
there are people who are claiming that already the change in temperature has brought about, or the change in total heat content of the atmosphere has brought about an increase in the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, related to those, wildfires, things like that. Okay, so suppose it doesn't cause all that much warming that people feel, but what if it causes more of these problems?
Okay, it's possible that the physics effects now will give rise to alternate patterns, right? Then you've got to say, let's have a look at the evidence. What do we see? Now we find, for example, if you look at hurricanes striking the United States coast, the decade during which the most hurricanes struck the United States coast was the 1940s. It's not now. So people don't give you all the information. And unfortunately, in this business, there are a number of extreme green extremists who go out of their way to ensure that they confuse people, because they've got a political agenda where they're not trying to tell you the truth, they're trying to win the argument. And as far as they're concerned, they want to win the argument, and if it's a case of distorting the truth a bit or something, they say it's all okay because it suits our purpose. And this is where the dishonesty comes in. It's not true that these weather events are increasing, and also climate is measured over a period of 30 or 40 years. You can't say the climate this year is different to the climate last year. It's just an invalid argument. And in fact, Mark Twain, there was a quotation of Mark Twain, I don't remember the exact words, but he said, when you go somewhere, you expect climate, but when you arrive there, you find weather. So, you can go to somewhere where they tell you it's a mild climate and it can rain for the whole week. So things like these floods and so on, there's always been floods. Now, with the advanced television that we have, the advanced ability to transmit pictures across the world and so on, which is now incredible in comparison to 20 years ago or something. If there's a flood somewhere in the world, it's rapidly on the television news. 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, you didn't get it, or you didn't even know it existed. So now one
Yeah.
tends to feel that there's more because every time there's an incident, somebody's putting it on television news. Oh, another look on television news, there's a flood every day or something. Then they tell you fires or as a result. It's not. The fires, the fires come about like in California largely because they prohibit controlled burning to stop this. Um, the people wanting to
The
save the
buildup.
environment, which I'm one. I'm a great environmentalist, and that I really believe on looking after the environment, God's earth, and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
saying we're going to disallow fires, like in Yellowstone National Park some years, there was a massive fire. And what happened is that controlled burning had not been allowed, so that the undergrowth and everything builds up to the point of when some spark ignites it, you then have flames. And burning of the bush and that is something that has been natural in nature forever. It's not
Yeah.
unusual. So a lot of these
Yeah.
fires come about because of the policies and so on, not because of the fires got any worse because of the heat. It can be a bit drier and
Yeah.
so
In
yes,
fact,
there
here in the
can be
USA,
factors, but it's
uh,
just not true. Mm,
here in the USA, both the number of fires and the total area burned annually fell drastically from the 19
mm,
teens and 20s right up through about the last 5 years or so. And they've ticked upward a little bit. A tiny part of that drastic fall has been erased over the last few years, but not because of anything having to do with temperature, but as you just mentioned, because of policies preventing the removal of undergrowth that turns a small, relatively easily controlled fire into a blazing, inferno. But also
correct.
because, particularly in California's case, uh, California's energy policy has so undermined the financial stability of the electric utilities there that they have not been able to afford to keep up their power lines as carefully as they
Mm,
used to do. And so
okay,
some
that
of the,
shows
a
you.
fair number of the fires have been ignited because those power lines failed in heavy winds. And they wouldn't have failed a decade
Mm,
ago. But the
mm,
policy
okay.
forcing these utilities to use more wind and solar is actually harming them financially and resulting in these
Mm,
sorts of problems. So,
well,
Kelvin,
mm,
somebody says, okay, but listen, um, even if adding CO2 to the atmosphere isn't causing a great increase in temperature, and even if, as you say, it's not causing an increase in the frequency or the severity of severe weather events, nonetheless, those carbon dioxide emissions are coming from our burning fossil fuels, and there are toxic fumes that come from that. There are pollution problems that come from that. There's fine particle pollution and so on. Doesn't it just make sense for us to get away from fossil fuels anyway, even if global warming is not a problem?
well, I believe in due course mankind will move away from fossil fuels and go over probably entirely to nuclear power. If you look back in history, you had horse-drawn vehicles until motor cars came about. You had people using peat for energy. You had people
Hmm.
using wood. In fact, there's indications that certain archaeological towns and cities that have been found, and they wondered why they were suddenly deserted. And it turns out that quite possibly one of the things that caused the city to fail in the end was the fuel price went up because people cut down trees nearby and they carried them and they cut down the next trees and next trees. And eventually it became so difficult to go and fetch the wood that you were cutting down
Yeah.
that people abandoned the cities. So this is the type of thing that happens. There's natural evolutions. It wasn't long ago that coal and oil was not part of mankind's existence. It's only been around the last sort of 200 years. So I believe we will move through this phase, but right now it's not going to happen in the next half century as far as I'm concerned. There's just a lot of coal and oil and so on still around. You're quite right. The sulfur um, oxides, dioxides, trioxides, and so on, what they call SOxes and NOxes, the NO, nitrous
Yes.
oxide, and the sulfur oxides. They're the ones that are corrosive and cause lung problems. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is not a problem. We breathe it out all the time. Plants love it. Plants thrive on carbon dioxide. And there are methods to have like electrostatic precipitators and coal-fired power stations to pull most of the bad stuff out of the emissions. You're not going to get it all out, but you're going to get a lot. So these, and there again, an advanced power station is going to burn very well. They have modern thing called Healy coal, H-E-L-E, coal fire power, which is
Hmm.
the high efficiency coal systems,
Yep.
modern
Yeah.
ones. Now, this is completely different also to people in less developed countries that are burning coal in a very unsophisticated manner, that a lot of soot and
Hmm.
all sorts of junk is coming off. Now, what you want is to help them, say, burn coal better or get nuclear, for example, so they can
Yeah.
voluntarily move to the new thing. Telling them to try now not have reliable coal and go on to wind and solar and something like that is just not nice and it's not honorable. And that's what these couple of African presidents have already said that I mentioned a while ago, that we find European people pitching up in Africa. And Africa is huge, by the way. Africa is bigger
Yes,
than
indeed.
United States, China, the whole of Europe, and India and Japan added together. It's
Yeah.
massive. So we get countries here where in South Africa, for example, South Africa is the whole same size as the whole of Western Europe. The distance from where
Hmm.
I am now in Pretoria down to Cape Town, where there's a nuclear power station, is the same as Rome to London. We've got a very beautiful arid area sort of in the middle of the country called the Karoo. It has it's a beautiful sensation to go through there. It's not desert, it's almost a semi-desert, but it's large. And I was quite astounded myself a couple of years ago when I discovered that the Karoo is bigger than Germany. Now we ride through it in a day to the other side in a car. It's bigger than Germany. Then you get people coming from Germany and say, this is the way you must make electricity because this is what we do. And you say, but it's completely different to us. We get in a motor car and we drive and we're quite ready to drive, say, 300-400 kilometers before your next refueling point when you're going on one of these long trips. That type of thing is just not possible in Europe. There's no ways you can drive 400 kilometers before the next opportunity to get fuel.
Yeah.
So the basic assumptions of so much of the first world is just wrong when you try and apply them to Africa, and for that matter, many other. I'm going to keep referring to Africa, but the same will apply to South America, Indonesia, many other
Sure.
places.
Yeah.
So we find it a
Yeah.
huge cheek when some of these advanced first world countries arrive here in a very superior manner and say, we've come to tell you how to do it properly. We say, you don't know anything about what goes on here. And that is a big
Yeah.
snag. And I think this is going to come out quite forcefully in COP26, because I think that COP26 now, there's going to be quite a backlash against the extremist view. I get that feeling because I
Yeah.
think the
I think
Greens
so
have
too.
overplayed their hand to the point to which people are saying, we've had enough of this now. Now we've got to face
Yeah.
sense. So I suspect
Yeah.
we'll see that happening.
Yeah. In fact, one of the scholars associated with the Cornwall Alliance, Vijay Jayaraj, climate scientist in India, just had a new article published that will go up on our website. I believe it's tomorrow, uh, all about how so much of the world, basically 40% of the world's population, has clearly said, we're not going for any kind of a massive prohibition of the use of fossil fuels. You in the West use them to climb out of poverty. We need to use them to climb out of poverty as well. But you mentioned the problem of trying to impose wind and solar on developing countries. Yet the wind is free, sunlight is free. Uh, don't we get free energy from wind and solar?
Well, in fact, coal and oil are free too. They're just lying under the ground. You've got to go and fetch them. It's not the coal that costs the money, it's getting it out. That's where the cost comes in. But in principle, the coal's free. It's just lying under the ground. They dig down and fetch it. So when somebody sells coal, they're selling it because of the effort they've gone to get it and then sell it and turn it into energy. That's the same with solar and wind. Solar and wind is not free. The fact that the sunlight comes down, you've got to convert that into a usable electricity. For a start, the silicon cells that are used in solar photovoltaics produce direct current of like 12 volts, 24 volts, those sorts of levels. In the
Mhm.
US, you use 110 volts alternating current. We use 220 volts alternating current. So you've got to turn that direct current into alternating current through an electrical system. All of that costs money. So by the time you've done all that, you've now got to the point where you now want to sell the solar. And then what they also
Uh-huh.
tend to do, those fellows, is they tell you what the price of solar is at their front gate at lunchtime. And that's dishonest because I want to know what the price of solar is at my house. And not only at
Yeah.
lunchtime, I want to say, if you're telling me to use solar, what does it cost me to use solar at night? Now, there's no solar at night. So if they want to supply solar at night, they've got to put in a battery system or hydrogen or one of these tricks that they're coming up with now. Then you've got to put in double or triple, in fact, the amount of solar so that because you can't use it and store it at the same time, of course. So if you've got a football field size of solar cells, you need 3 football fields at the very least if you're going to charge batteries as well to try and use in the dark. So then you got to say, well, hang on,
Hmm.
triple the at least triple. In fact, triple's little. It'll be at least five, 6 times or something. And so then you'd have to say, put the real cost together, and now tell me what I will pay if you want to give me 24 hours a day reliable solar power. And that's a completely different ballgame. Now, in the case of
Yes,
something
but of
like
course the
coal or nuclear, they
government,
can tell.
but the government can subsidize that generation of power from solar and wind. And so then what we
Correct.
pay as consumers at our homes in our utility bills doesn't have to be so high, right?
No, because the subsidy's got to come from somewhere. Remember, the government has no money. No government has any money. All they're doing is spending your money that they've taken from you. So if the government subsidizes something, it's taking more of your money through taxation and then spending it where they want to spend it. So when you say they're subsidizing it as well, if you look at something like solar and wind, 2 of them, if you've got a coal-fired power station, say, or nuclear, either of them, the staff is still getting paid. So what happens is you have your
Mhm.
coal-fired power station, then you have solar. So, oh, the sun's shining, use the solar. So they telephone, so to speak, the coal-fired power station and say, cut your production. So they cut the production of the coal because the sun's shining. But the coal fellows are still at work getting paid full salaries. There's still
Mhm.
um, costs for maintenance and the running of the plant and so on. So you're paying for the coal as well as paying for the solar. And
Yeah.
that also is not taken into account. You should say, well, when the coal plant is running at 50% or 20% capacity or something, that differential should be added onto the cost of the solar. You
Yeah.
shouldn't put it
Right.
onto the cost of the coal or the system. Then what happens? I went and visited such a plant in Germany, and I asked the fellows what's it like now, and they said the price of the coal power has gone up because they get this phone call, so to speak. They don't just do it with a phone; it's done other ways, but I'm just going to say phone call for simplicity. They get the phone call and say, "Cut the output. We've got solar and wind." So they cut the output, and everybody sits and they wait. Then all of a sudden they get a phone call. Oh, some rain clouds have come over. Something we need coal now, urgently. So they've got to ramp up fast. Now normally
This
they don't do it. So
instant.
then what they do is, yes, instant. Then they squirt liquid oil into the burners, and it costs $1 million or something worth of oil that's got to be squirted because you've got to get now the coal temperature up very fast, particularly the German coal, because they largely burn this brown lignite that is very poor quality coal.
Yes.
So say you pump this oil in, now you jack up the ramp speed. And so from maintenance point of view, you induce problems. So the foreman there was telling me they have much more many more breakdowns and much more maintenance expenditure and so on now than they had
Mhm.
in the past, where they just had to run steadily 24 hours a day, keeping it as uniform as possible. Now
Yeah.
they go up, down, more oil, up, down, oil, up, down, oil, up, down, oil. And he says that now is
Yeah.
causing the coal that they do use to go up in price. And all this sort of
yeah,
thing is hidden. It's not honest. Then somebody says, but look how
right,
cheap the coal, the solar is, or look how cheap the wind is, but we'll hide all this other stuff.
yeah, yeah,
And you say, wait a minute, at the end of the day, the German electricity bills are going up phenomenally. France, on the other
yeah,
hand, which is three-quarters nuclear, has got a consumer electricity price less than half that of the Germans. There's your
yes,
evidence. France has been running on nuclear predominantly for many years,
yeah,
decades, and they've shown that it works and it's cheaper and that they produce less
yeah.
CO2 and everything like that, if that's what worries you. So the evidence is
As
there. And
as we as we spoke a little bit before we went on the program, you mentioned that you consider small modular nuclear reactors a very
mm,
promising technology for providing electricity around Africa. Uh, I
right.
want you to get into explaining that a bit, but first I want you to address one other thing that almost invariably comes up in these social settings where you get into climate change discussions, and that is, well, listen, Dr. Kelvin Kem, you are one physicist, but
Mm,
97% of all scientists
mm,
agree that global warming is real, that it's overwhelmingly man made, that it is already bringing huge damage to the earth and its ecosystems. We've already got millions of climate refugees, and it's going to be catastrophic. It really is an existential threat to the earth. Why should we believe you, one physicist, instead of the 97% of all scientists who tell us that?
well, for a start, the 97% is very, very wrong. That figure keeps getting quoted. And in fact, just the fact that somebody's at 97 should worry you, because how on earth would you get that accuracy? But what happened is some Australian researcher by the name of Cook um, did this. Now, I don't know whether he did it completely understanding exactly what he was doing. I suspect he didn't. But what he did is he sent out a questionnaire to 2,000 something other scientists. I don't remember the exact number. And he asked questions like, do you agree? Do you believe there's global warming taking place? I would say yes. As I've said, there has been over since
Yeah,
Abraham Lincoln has gone up a degree. So they said yes. And then he asked a question like, do you believe that mankind has had some influence on this? And I said, yeah, it can be. And anyway, what happened is that as they went down with these about half a dozen questions, the number of people that agreed went down and down and down and down. They discounted them. You could easily look this up. And eventually it came out that, in fact, the number of people that would really agree that industrial carbon dioxide is the cause of climate change is less than 3% in that number. It isn't that 97. The 97 do
yeah,
not say that at all. And that number has been falsely propagated all over the place. It's just not true. You
yeah,
know, I mean, I have people regularly in newspapers that accusing me of denying that there's global warming. I've never denied there's global. There is some global warming,
yeah,
1 degree since Charles Darwin. What I deny is that it's anthropogenic carbon dioxide that is the cause. That's where I say I disagree. Now, in fact, many scientists agree with me. I think far greater number than on the other side. But unfortunately, the media um, suppresses this information. It's just very
mhm,
sad. I think now the media is starting to change a bit. I'm seeing a lot more people prepared to listen to the other side. But for some time, for
yeah,
some years now, they just wanted to listen to the scaremongers and the gloom and doom.
yeah,
But many prominent
yeah,
people agree with me. But when there have been petitions and things drawn up by the people in my camp and they presented, they suppressed. There's a number of them that people can look up, going back years now. So without a
yeah. There
doubt,
is,
it's not at all true
for
that all
instance,
these scientists supposedly agree.
yeah,
The science is settled story is completely untrue. It's not.
yeah,
There's far
the
more to
Oregon
it.
Institute
You should
for
just say to
Science
yourself,
and
it can't be
Medicine.
that easy. Yeah,
Yeah, the Oregon
it can't be
Institute for
that easy.
Science and Medicine has a
Mm,
petition up at petitionproject.org that says that
yes.
there is no persuasive scientific evidence that human emissions of CO2 are causing dangerous global warming or anything else dangerous associated with it, and that in fact those emissions of CO2 are actually very helpful to the earth because they increase plant growth. That's been signed by over 31,000 scientists, including over
Correct.
10,000 climate scientists specifically.
Correct.
So,
Mm,
the 97% claim, frankly, would be true only if you limited it to, has the world warmed in the last 100 years? And
mm,
has human emission of CO2 contributed significantly to that warming? And
mm,
unfortunately, most people in popular conversation, they'll hear significantly and they'll right away think majority. Well, that's not the way
mm,
scientists think. Scientists can think,
mm,
well, a 2% contribution would be significant, right? Well,
mm.
the most you can get the 97% consensus on is, yeah, it's warmed and human activity has contributed. But anything
Yeah.
about dangerous, anything about human activity being the primary driver, anything about threatening catastrophic harm in the future, none of that appears in the consensus. And then to make one other point before we get to discussing the small modular nuclear reactors and how helpful they are for Africa, one other point on this is that frankly consensus is not a scientific value. As you point out
Exactly.
in your article, Michael Crichton, the great author of marvelous science fiction books, but who was also a very fine scientist himself, a
Mm,
Harvard educated medical doctor. Uh, Crichton points out, if it's consensus, it's not science. If it's science, it's
correct.
not consensus. Consensus is a political value. You want to know who
Mm,
won an election? You count votes. But if you want to know how
correct.
much warming effect CO2 has on the atmosphere, you don't count scientists' noses. You do the hard empirical observations necessary to try to tease out from correlations what really might be causation, and that's a very different thing entirely. Well,
Yeah, it is. And, you
we're
know,
getting about 10 minutes from our close here. And I do want you, because you have done so much work in nuclear, and I embrace wholeheartedly your very hopeful expectations about nuclear. I think it's undoubtedly the world's safest, and were it not for excessive regulatory barriers, it would be the world's cheapest, probably, energy
mm,
source,
well,
and
mm,
cleanest, without doubt. Tell us more about
mm,
these small modular reactors and how they can be especially helpful in a situation like Africa where the distances are so enormous. Most
mm,
people in Europe and North America just can't imagine the kinds of
correct.
distances that people go in Africa to get from town to town. Tell us how these help.
Well, over many years, nuclear reactors developed a lot and they became larger and larger, like happens with many things, trucks and cars and whatever, as this technology develops. So reactors became bigger and bigger. You get scale efficiencies and so on and so forth. And so they produced 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 megawatts out of nuclear plants. But a big issue with those large nuclear reactors is they were water cooled and you needed water. And the water typically was the ocean or some very big lake, water source like that. And so you were limited to building those big nuclear power stations where you had the water. Now in South Africa, we've got such a power station down in Cape Town on the coast, and it produces South Africa's cheapest electricity by far. And in the 1990s, these scientists here, the nuclear people, said, let's have a look at how we bring more power inland other than what we use now, which is coal and a bit of hydro and so on. So they said, right, now, as you, I think, well know, South Africa is a big mining country. We've got some very big mines
Mhm.
that are inland. Now, you've got miners where you find the minerals, and sometimes they're in arid areas uh, far away from other places. And so the mining towns develop around them. So they said, how do we take electricity there? So they said, right, we can't carry coal all the way there. The moment we do it with long power lines. So they said, let's see if we can put nuclear power inland. And that means no water, because there isn't water.
Mm.
So the idea came about to have them gas cooled using helium gas. And so let's put a little reactor that'll produce 100, 200, 300 megawatts, not 1,000, 3,000 megawatts, 200 or so. So a reactor was designed called the pebble bed modular reactor. And the idea with a modular is that you can make them in factories, for example, and you take the parts out there and you just put it all together because you haven't got all the construction stuff on site. If you're going into a remote area, you want to take it all like a Lego set and put it together. But also, you want to be able to put one reactor, 100 megawatts, connect it to a control room, and then when it's running and you need more power, you build another reactor and you connect it to the same control room. So it was designed that you could take up to 10 reactors, connect them to one control room, and you add them as you need the power, and also it's financially easier to do this progressively. So that was what was done. This was designed. It was designed and developed to the point to which we could build that reactor in 2008, the pebble bed modular reactor. Then the financial crisis hit in the United States due to that mortgage story. That then cascaded into some of the big US banks not being able to honor pledges that they'd given to us for funding. We had a change of government. The new president came in and said, let's just put a whole lot of things on hold while you think twice. There was then the anti-nuclear sentiment around the world. And what happened is that reactor, they stopped developing that one. Then a group of private people came along and said, well, let's take a variant to that. So they developed another one now called the HTMR 100, 100 standing for 100 megawatts. There was a privately developed variant of that, which has been designed to be simpler and cheaper and faster to build. So that one now is in private hands and has been 10 years in development. We can start developing that right away. We're looking for international funding and so on. Now the frame of mind around the world is improving. So we've got this reactor now that does not need water, so you can put it anywhere. And as you mentioned, the very big countries of Africa, if you find you want to put electricity 800 kilometers away from where there's a big dam or a potential hydro source, you can just decide to put it there. And you've just seen our electricity's come back on. The light is coming
Congratulations.
automatically there. Yeah, it's magic. So what happened is that the reactor was developed for this purpose, to be able to go to arid areas and so on, but it becomes an ideal reactor to put into many African countries and countries around the world. But then interest was coming about from first world countries. Well, they said, wait a minute, we don't have to just have the big ones all the time. We can put small ones dotted all over the place. Now, also with the small modular reactor in the African context and others, you can have a small grid. You can have a grid that's only, say, 5 or 10 miles in radius. You don't have to connect that grid into the national grid. You can have a small grid that services only a mining area or something. And so we'll have a privately owned, private electricity company that supplies a circle in principle of something like 20, 30 miles wide. And you can do that. Then you can have another one somewhere else. Later, if you want to join them up, you can. So the ability to think up new approaches entirely is there. We don't have to have a whole European grid. By the way, there's no such thing as the German electricity grid or the French electricity grid or anything like that. No. Europe is so interconnected that they become each other's insurance policy. That's another very important thing. There's a whole pan-European grid. So at any time, if the Germans are short of power because the wind fails or something, all they do is bring nuclear power in from France or bring hydro in from Norway or something. So they're also in a completely different position to African countries, where in African country, if you run out of power, there's nobody to pick up the phone to and say, can we have power from you? Because the distances are so great and there isn't interconnections over all of those distances. So you're on your own. Yeah. And that is also not brought out. They say, well, why don't you do what the Germans do? But what the Germans are doing is they've got a huge insurance policy of all the countries around them that are there to back them up if they get into trouble. So they have a lot less failures if they make a policy mistake. All that happens is the price keeps rising and rising. So to my mind, the small modular reactors are a real answer. They're not going to displace the big reactors as well. You want the big reactors that you can put on the coastline or buy a dam to pump big power into a country wherever you want it. But certainly the small ones are cheaper, simpler. There's a whole lot of reasons why a smaller country, for example, can put one in. When I was in Minneapolis, the state people, they asked me to describe it to them. They said, well, they're very interested in putting small modular reactors. The
Hmm.
Canadians are interested in using them now to get the tar sands out so they can, out of the frozen ground, so they can extract the oil. So there's all sorts of uses coming about for these small modular reactors in advanced countries. They're not only for the developing countries. And so we're going to find a cascade of countries that are going to get into it. Right now, there's something like a dozen African countries that have notified the International Atomic Energy Agency that they intend to follow a nuclear future based on
Yeah,
putting in small reactors like this for starters. And I really see
yeah.
that as a very much of a growing exercise. And the one we've
I
got
think
has been
that's
designed ideally for those conditions, you know.
yeah. I think that's tremendous, and I think it really does have a lot of promise for Africa. Um, I just want to help people think a little more clearly about the distances and whatnot. Um, I just looked up real quickly the population density of Germany. And I'm
Mm,
speaking here as an American. We speak in terms of square miles typically. It's about 623 people per square mile, whereas the population
okay.
density of South Africa is about 127 people per square mile. So well over
Right.
5 times the density. And South Africa is one of the denser African countries. There are plenty of others with
Mm, mm.
far lower density.
With less.
I think
Mm,
the average density for sub-Saharan African countries is around about 60 people per square mile.
mm.
And so when we're thinking in
Right.
terms of providing electric power for these sorts of situations, the densities
Correct.
and the low, I'm sorry, the distances between towns or cities and the low density of the overall land, excuse me, just
Mm,
makes the idea of following the European or North American grid model really quite impractical. Um, I also wanted just to
mm.
quickly ask you because most people are not accustomed to thinking in terms of megawatts of power. I mean, I think most of us about the highest we tend to go in watts is okay, a 250-watt light bulb. All right. Uh, how many how many private homes would typically be served by 100 megawatts of power from a small modular reactor?
It's tens of thousands. You know, it's probably 150,000 or something like that. I
Uh-huh.
don't particularly like quoting numbers like it because, of course, it depends on how many bulbs you have. Because I found that the solar and
Right.
wind people often come along and say, put this in, look how many houses we can power. They don't go and say, if it's a solar thing, we can turn on so many lights, but only at lunchtime. You say, but we don't want the lights at lunchtime. And in the dark, they can do nothing. But they just calculate the total megawatt hours. They take a very small allocation to a house, and then they tell you how many houses, and then they push the numbers to great degree. Now, I'd like to just mention a moral point here, which I feel quite strongly about. You know, in South Africa, we need to double our electricity consumption. In South Africa, 85% of the population have got access to electricity. The remaining 15 are people that are living on the tops of hills or mountains or somewhere or far away. And it's not from lack of will to try and get to them, it's just they're too jolly far away to get to at the moment. So they aren't electrified. So we need to double the electricity consumption at least.
Hmm.
Other African countries are 10%, 15, 20% electrified. So if
Yes.
you 15, 20% electrified, the only honorable thing that the government of that country can do is aim to double electricity consumption as quickly as possible, and then double it again, and then double it again,
Yeah.
and then double it
Yeah.
again. Now,
Yes.
meantime, we get first world people say, cut back on your electricity consumption, stop using it, go for low energy. This, yeah, I'm all in favor of going for lower energy bulbs or whatever, but you can't go to a country that's 20% electrified, where a child dies if the child gets sick because you can't get to a hospital, clinic out in a rural area, when you get there, there's no electricity or something. You
Yeah,
can't do that, you know. These kids deserve to be able to go to school and have lights at school, and deserve to be able to go to clinics and find the clinic operates with X-ray machines and everything like this. You can't go along to a country that's 20% electrified and say, Germany tells you to cut your consumption. That's immoral. Say, well, just let the kids die.
absolutely.
You know, too much of
Absolutely.
that is happening already. You can't do that. You've got to say that the human life comes first. And particularly when a lot of the so-called climatic effects, all these extra storms, or they're just plain and simply not true. If you look up the figure, they're just not true. There are
Right.
no more floods now than there were 50 years ago. There are no more this and that and that and that. So the numbers are just not true. So it's distorted while kids die. That's not fair. It's just not reasonable. It's not moral. You know, people have got to sit and say, you know,
Oh,
what do you really in your heart? Are you supporting cutback on electricity? So, well, so what if a few 100,000 children die? I'm just going to laugh that off. You can't do that.
and that kind of concern is exactly why the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation exists. We have seen
Hmm.
all too many policies promoted by green activists, by green politicians, and whatnot that condemn the poor around Africa, Asia, Latin America to further generations of really extreme
Hmm.
poverty and high rates of
Hmm.
disease and premature death that inevitably accompany that kind of extreme poverty. So you you hit the nail right on the head there. When I think, for example, that the average sub-Saharan African woman spends 6 to 8 hours a day doing nothing but gathering wood and dried dung to use for
Hmm.
an open cooking fire and to heat her hut, and the smoke from that brings illness to millions every year. The
Yes.
World Health
Yeah.
Organization estimates that it kills about 3 to 4 million people a year, mostly women and young children. Now, I happen to think that that estimate is probably an exaggeration because it comes from models of the
Hmm.
impact uh, small, very, very fine particulate matter on people's lungs that are themselves mistaken. But nonetheless, uh, if we're talking about what is bringing illness and premature death to people in Africa, it has nothing to do with climate change. It has everything to
Right.
do
Well,
with the lack of
this
access
is, uh,
to
mm, mm,
reliable, affordable, abundant,
absolutely.
instant on demand, there 24/7, 365, whenever you want it, energy through electricity. And
Mm.
and the COP26 in Glasgow right now is trying to persuade African countries and Asian countries and Latin American countries to slow their rise out of poverty. They're not putting it that way. They're not saying, oh, what we want you to
Mm.
do is to slow your rise out of poverty. But they're saying, we want you to depend on unreliable, very expensive
Right.
energy sources instead of the fossil fuels that lifted us out of poverty. Well, that
Right.
means staying poor longer. And I think
Exactly.
that that's just morally unconscionable. So I really
Mm.
appreciate your making that point. We pretty much reached the end here. We've even gone over a little bit. You got a closing comment for us, Kelvin?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. And I'd like to say to people who are watching, give it a bit more thought and say to yourself, is it fair that developed first world people can sit in judgment in a very simplistic manner and send out instructions and then force other countries to toe the line? And the result is the death of
Yeah.
people and misery and all sorts of things like that, because it's real. That's what's actually happening. And it's just not reasonable. There's more to this than meets the eye. Don't just believe what you're told all the time in the popular press. Sit and think a bit more deeply and say, what's really going on there? And are the consequences as simple as we're told? They're not. There's more to this than meets the eye. The human cost, as well as the science issues, is not understood clearly around the world at all. So give it some thought.
All right. Excellent. Dr. Kelvin Kem, South African physicist and a wonderful, wonderful champion of the rights of the poor around the world to rise out of poverty by using the abundant, affordable, reliable energy sources that the rest of us have already benefited from. I would encourage you to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the blog link, and then scroll down just a little bit, and you'll find Kelvin's article, Climate Change, Ebb and Flow of the Tide, that gives you a really excellent way of carrying on casual conversations about climate change that are likely to come up during the rest of this week and through all of next week as the UN Global Climate Summit goes on in Glasgow. COP26 is making the news all over, so lots of people will be talking about it. You can be well equipped to discuss that if you go to Cornwall Alliance and read Kelvin's article, Climate Change, Ebb and Flow of the Tide. Next week, we're going to have a special guest, and I'm not even going to tell you yet who it is, but this is going to be a very special guest to discuss with us what has been up to that time done at the COP26 Global Climate Summit in Glasgow. And we're going to have a lot of fun with this. I think there are a lot of things going on already, even in just the first 2.5, 3 days of the conference, that were not anticipated very well by the people who put this together. So we'll have fun next week. I do want to remind you, too, that throughout the month of November, as our way of saying thank you for a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any amount, we would love to send you this brand new book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Liberty, Civil Liberty, by my friend David Fowler. He's a lawyer. He's a former Tennessee state senator. He's the president of Family Action Council of Tennessee, factn.org. And this book explains how, by using the Ninth Amendment, which says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, this points to the reality that there are rights recognized in common law long before the Constitution was ever drafted, and that exceed the rights actually mentioned either in the Constitution itself or in the Bill of Rights that accompanies the Constitution. And as we learn to think back through these ideas that were in the minds of the founders of the Constitution, we can use them to push back against activist federal and state courts that have often ruled invalid laws passed by various states to protect human life from abortion, for example, or to protect religious liberty. This book is wonderful if you care about restoring and even enlarging the liberties enjoyed by the American people. I think you'll want to read this book. You'll want to share it with your pastor, with other people you know who are influential in your community. This is a great opportunity for us as Americans to restore our constitutional order. So to ask for your free copy of this, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form there, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-11, that's 21-11, or the title, Recovering the Constitution, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. Thanks again for joining us this evening on From the Stacks. Take care. Hope to see you next week.